Well, welcome you both. We're here for one of our first podcasts for the Silicon Sanctuary podcast. I'm here with Dr. Craig Schindler, received his BA magna cum laude from Stanford University and holds a law degree from Stanford Law School and a PhD in psychology and religion from the University of California at Berkeley.
Man after my own heart.
And graduate theological union. He was assistant professor of environmental ethics at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and has also taught at Harvard Divinity School, Stanford University, and Trinity College. Thank you for joining us. I'm also here with Ryan Francis, an educator colleague of mine, and has his own podcast called Educate for Life. Welcome, and thank you for coming.
Absolutely. Happy to be here.
Thank you. So I actually... whether we edit this out or not, but I just thought it would be really nice if we could start with a meditation practice so we can get into a different theta state. Maybe, Craig, you can lead us through that. That'd be
Sweet.
Really nice.
Sure. So let me invite all of us to take a moment and actually practice slowing down. I often like to say that the fastest way to get there is to slow down. And so let's just start by taking some deep cleansing breaths from your belly, letting yourself relax into the present moment, and starting to feel your entire body. Maybe start with the feet and just feel the inside of your feet, and then the inside of your legs coming on up to the pelvis, and the inside of your diaphragm, being present with the breath, letting your shoulders relax, and then feeling a wave of relaxation go down your arms to your elbows and out to your wrists and your hands, and bringing the awareness up to your neck, loosening up the neck, and feeling the awareness behind your face. Letting your forehead relax, your eyelids, and especially your jaw muscles. And then just for a moment, be aware of your breath and see if you can feel your entire body on the inside. They say that an octopus has 9 brains, 1 brain in every arm and 1 central brain. And we're like that in that we have the cellular awareness of our entire inner body. Feet, legs, arms, hands, diaphragm, head. See if you can just feel your entire inner body with your breath as an attunement to be right here in the timeless now. Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk, says that hurry is a violence we do to time. So whenever we slow down, we come into this sense of spaciousness with regard to time. So we're slowing down together so that we can expand the experience of time and see what wants to happen. And then when you're ready, just bring yourself back out and come on back.
Nice.
Yeah, that was nice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is, I'm always bringing up the topic of self-awareness, the practice of self-awareness being, integral and essential, to all beings being able to come out of their ego identity and be more, effectual in their daily lives, recognizing their stories with their identification about themselves, past stories, and even subconscious stories that were, maybe ingrained within our neurobiology as well. I know that you are, one of the things that you've been working on is Project Victory, which is very essential right now in this time and place, especially what's going on currently in history, currently in politics. And it seems to me like there's a very large shift happening. And I was wondering if you would speak about that a little bit.
Let's try this little thought experiment for a minute,
Okay.
which is that if suddenly all the carbon was removed from our atmosphere and from the oceans, all the carbon is gone, all the plastic is cleared, and there's no shift in our consciousness. We're still the same in terms of the way we're objectifying each other and the earth and seeing the earth as a resource rather than a living, sentient biosphere that we exist within and that we are. If there's no shift in our consciousness, then how long would it take for us to start to quickly degrade the planet? So the challenge we're in is the challenge of an evolutionary jump that is both an inner and outer transformation, in that it's about us waking up to our own sentient being and therefore honoring the beings all around us, whether they're in human form or animal form, or in terms of the network of living trees that we now know science tells us are actually communicating with each other. That shift, and then the compassionate action that it requires us to clean the planet and to actually restore the earth in a way that we're then, instead of being pillagers who are going out to space, we're pilgrims of the light going out to space, but we've restored our home planet. So that's the inner outer transformation that we've been calling for the last 30 years. We've been working on this, the Great Turning. And of course, the Dalai Lama refers to it as the revolution of compassion. And Dr. King called it the beloved community, creating the beloved community. That shift.
Interesting. I've just been reflecting lately about, the what appears to be a revolution. It appears to be a revolutionary time in history and politics. To me, it's somewhat similar to the era of the first revolution that I was aware of during my lifetime in the late 60s and 70s, in the shift from, the anti-Vietnam War movement, the civil rights movement, the women's empowerment movement, and just a whole cultural shift. It seems similar, but it seems exponential. So I was just wondering your reflections and thoughts about that and what the purpose of that is.
Yeah, there's a painting that I would love to show you both that I actually asked one of my dear friends of my son's, who's a beautiful artist, Elijah, to do. And it's a painting of a dark landscape with the mountains that kind of represents the history of humanity. And then there is a sun coming over the mountains, the emergence of dawn. And you see all these streams of light coming down the mountain into our time. So really, that revolution that you're talking about, Allison, is really a continuation of all of these different movements. So let me give you an example. So if you take, for example, the women's movement. So 1848, you have Sojourner Truth, you have Elizabeth Cady Stanton, you have Susan B. Anthony, and they're declaring in 1848 that women have the right to control their lives because they have no rights whatsoever at that time. They're declaring that, and they have this gathering at Seneca Falls in 1848. That stream of consciousness comes all the way down into our time. And women rising is part of the Great Turning. Or John Muir recognizing that we need to put these parks aside all around the world to preserve the wilderness and to conserve the vital force that we are part of in the wilderness. That environmental movement coming down all the way to our time. So these streams are coming into our time: human rights, civil rights, women's rights, the environmental movement, the organic food revolution, meditation, mediation, inner peace. They're all coming down into what Dr. King called a mighty river of love and compassion. So it's the same unfolding, but now, as you point out, it's the urgency is more profound because we are drifting, some would say hurtling, towards our own extinction. Because every time that an entire ecosystem collapses, which we know is happening, and we feel that grief in our body, we put ourselves more and more at risk, certainly in terms of human civilization. So the urgency for, if you will, an enlightened and compassionate awareness to be rising on the planet right now. And see, it's a joyful thing. I mean, Paul Hawken has this beautiful thing. He says, look, it's very important to remember that climate change isn't just happening to us. It's also happening for us because it's going to compel us to come together. There is a worldwide rising. It's just that we don't fully see it yet. And the reason we know there's a rising is because as the weather patterns get more extreme, the droughts get more extreme, the oceans rise, more and more people will wake up and stand up together and say, okay, we're going in the wrong direction. And there really is something joyful here about turning it around.
Yeah,
it's ultimately a joyful call.
Right.
I think it's wonderful that you can have that perspective because I definitely catch myself moving in and out of judgment around what's happening right now. And some of that I think is valuable for me to be in judgment, in that it activates my passion, which then also helps me activate my compassion in different circumstances. For one example, I love technology. It's deeply embedded in my life, and I see that the technology we use every day and is being developed every day is both the cause and the cure of our problem, because it's amplifying the human condition, it's amplifying our capacity to communicate. So it is both the thing that is theoretically causing global warming and climate change, and is also going to give us the means for communication and the rising that you're talking about in order to solve that same problem. It's like an application of the tool.
Yeah.
Misapplication versus effective application of the tool.
Yeah, and I don't mean to say that there isn't despair. I don't mean that the joyful dimensions of this awakening are Pollyanna, because I think we all can get in touch with judgment and despair. I mean, I heard a recording last night driving home of Greta talking to the 16-year-old Swedish young woman, talking to the United Nations. And she goes, what's going on here? We're all just talking about normal life and politics and how to make money and how to continue what we're doing, at the same time that we know that the Amazon has 9,000 fires burning in it, that whole ecosystems are collapsing. And when she said that, and I'm driving my car home last night, I felt this palpable grief in my heart, because I love this world, as do we all. I love this earth, I love the rivers. I love the mountains. I love all these animals and plants. I love the elephants and the giraffes. And I don't want my children and grandchildren to live in a world that is a desert, even if it's technologically still able to sustain life. Even somehow it sustains human life.
Exactly.
But we're bereft of all
the rest of life.
of the rest of life, and therefore we're bereft of a part of our own soul. Right? So there's despair. But then here's the paradox. choosing to believe that it's hopeless is like the booby prize. Because then we get to be right about, hey, I'm right. Dude, come on. I'm cynical. I'm right. Come on. It's going under. Come on. It's going on. What can we do? We're helpless. We're hopeless. I'm right. But that's just like in a relationship when two couples are sort of being right about their point of view, but they're not communicating. It's the booby prize. So the real thing is there's despair, then there's the denial. Okay, nothing's happening. I'm back. But of course, that doesn't help us address the problem. So the real thing I would suggest is commitment. And commitment has to do with you, each of us, making the commitment to get that, okay, you matter.
Yeah.
I matter, you matter. And stepping up and doing the thing that you see to do. Like if you, Ryan, see the way to take technology and make it more conscious in terms of education and awareness, then see, that's your calling.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Right. Absolutely.
And you don't have to do my calling.
Right.
And you don't have to do Allison's calling.
No. Yeah.
Right. It was interesting that you brought up, the word despair. And I know that one of the things that you've repeated to me several times is the notion of choosing hope. And it was interesting because I felt resistant to that when you originally said that, because to me, hope seemed not powerful enough to me. And it seemed almost like in my interpretation through my lens, it had an air of despair and desperateness to it. And then I started reflecting on it, knowing that I was going to speak to you today. And I thought, and I want you to help me develop and expand upon this, that hope is actually a catalyst for action. It is a space of grace where within we can act in that. It's almost like it's an element that creates an alchemy, as opposed to a tangible thing that we're going towards. It seemed to me like more it was the alchemy, the juice that would create the movement.
Yeah. That's beautifully said. Beautifully said. There's a quote that I want to give you about hope, because I think it makes a distinction here. But let me tell you a little background. So much of the 20th century, of course, Eastern Europe was under the rule of the Soviet Union. And Václav Havel was a famous Czech playwright who stood up against the Soviet government and the police state that Czechoslovakia was at that time. And he was for his dissidence, because what he would do is he would put on one of his plays and then everyone would go downstairs in the basement afterwards and practice democracy in the basement under the play. And he was thrown in prison for that. So he's writing in 1984 from a Soviet-controlled prison in Czechoslovakia. So now think about it for a moment. He has no hope in the sense of a tangible circumstance or outcome. He's in prison. He's been defeated. His movement's been crushed. He's writing from prison, 1984, and he writes a pamphlet called The Power of the Powerless. And what he says, quote, hope is an orientation of the soul, an attitude of the spirit that is not dependent upon external circumstances. So it's the way we get up in the morning. It's not about hope in the sense of, I see that, there's this specific thing that's going to happen. It can be about that. But as you say, Allison, hope engenders action. Action then generates a deepening of hope. 5 years later, the Berlin Wall comes down, the Iron Curtain falls. Václav Havel's pamphlet was a major source of inspiration for people to stand up in a nonviolent revolution, and he becomes the first president of the Democratic Republic of Czechoslovakia. But he had no reason, no data to support that. but he had the hope and the orientation. So, for example, in terms of this planet right now, can we turn things around? And I would say, well, we have to.
Yeah.
I mean, is there really a conversation here about not turning it around?
Yeah.
We have to turn it around for our children and their children, and for all the living species, that the beautiful sort of sense of the biosphere that, as E.O. Wilson says, Harvard biologist, that is the greatest gifts we've been given, is this existence on Earth.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So we have to turn it around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if I may, I'd like to tie in your original question with what you just said, and this is the idea of self-awareness and how we operate in self-awareness. Is I see two definitions of hope based on what you just said. I see hope as a choice, in so far as it's an orientation, as you described, one that specifically encourages resilience, and another type of hope, which is a type of escape, where we allow ourselves to release responsibility, to forgive ourselves of discomfort, to allow ourselves to be comfortable. Hope that is palliative versus hope that is resilience building. And I think that's the core part of self-awareness, is we must develop resilience. We must develop a tolerance for discomfort.
Yes.
And hope, as an orientation that you described, is a means to develop resilience. If I believe that there can be a better outcome and I can hope for that outcome, I can act toward that outcome. Whereas if I just go, oh, well, I hope things get better.
No, yeah, exactly.
Right.
I'm dismissing the discomfort and I'm not taking any responsibility for it. And I think that's that critical distinction as we develop our self-awareness, is that it's going to suck.
Beautiful.
It's going to hurt.
Beautiful.
It's going to be uncomfortable. That's despair is ingrained in that. You can have despair and have hope. In fact, sometimes they require each other in order to operate.
That is
Beautiful.
so spot on. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bravo. That was really well said. And I think tying that into what you said too, Craig, was, that each and every one of us matters. And I think a lot of people don't want to do the work to become conscious because they don't think they matter. They don't think that one life will make the difference, that one life could be exponential in making a difference. So I think that this time in our lives really speaks to that. Maybe you can add on about that.
Well, it's funny. That was beautifully said.
Thank you.
Yeah, you guys are great, by the way.
Oh, thanks.
This is fun.
This is fun.
This is really fun.
Good.
I loved it.
So
We'll do it again.
when you were talking, the person who flashed through, as an example of what you're talking about, was Rosa Parks. And I just want to set that stage for a minute, because if you take the negative version of hope, the palliative care version of hope, as you laid it out, and you go, okay, you bring it to the civil rights movements of 1954, 1955. So Rosa Parks would be saying, well, we have hope that things will change. But there's no personal responsibility, and there's no sense that she matters.
Yeah.
So when she chooses, and it was very intentional, I mean, they set it up as an intentional act for her to not be willing to sit at the back of the bus and to move up front. She, of course, sparks one of the major non-successful, non-violent demonstrations that this country has experienced. And I had the privilege of talking to Reverend Bert Ransom, who was a friend of Dr. King's and a young college student at the time, was kind of the King's handy person and nanny, and he just loved the Kings and was in and out of family. So he got to sort of be part of this whole thing in a bird's eye view. And he talks about the experience of when, 10,000 people stopped riding the bus, 10,000 African Americans in Montgomery, Alabama, and the streets are silent. And again, you get the power of the powerless. But there, you see, you have the experience and the illustration of the second kind of hope. That's the hope where it's an orientation of the soul. That's the self-awareness. But then it involves action. And when you gather people together, it's inspirational.
Yeah.
You know, as Bert Ransom said, he loved, you know, he's a minister, but he said, you know, when we shut down the buses in Montgomery, he said, you know, there was a palpable experience of heaven touching earth. Because we could feel that sense of the other shore. We could feel the transcendence. So see, this is
hope is an act of faith.
Hope with an act of faith. And the movement we're talking about is an inner-outer transformation. It has a spiritual, philosophic, personal dimension to it that enlivens us. That's what I'm trying to say is that we're now up against perhaps the greatest challenge, most daunting time that humanity's faced. But the other side of that is that we get to step into being that awake, that alive, that connected to each other.
You know, I wanted to dial it back from the macro view to more of the micro view. And one of the things that I'm very aware of is individual mental non-wellness in this country. Mental illness seems to be, if not, you know, so much more vast than it's ever been, or maybe we just have more knowledge of it through digital media, social media, you know, closing, you know, the gap of, you know, awareness. And I'm, you know, very concerned about young adults and kids, you know, suffering with mental illness. And if the cure is individual, that each and every one of us matters, I think there needs to be more education and awareness shed on how to become aware that your thoughts are not always true, how to become aware of the stories that you've been injected with in your family of origin, how to change the lenses of perception to see that you're seeing through a lens of perception. And, you know, starting very young when, you know, kids are starting to be able to have some levels of being able to process these thoughts. And I was wondering, you know, what your thoughts are or were on how we can, for me, I would want to shed a movement that starts there with the youth in America. So
once again, it's a tool, it's a use of tools, right? So your example of social media, there is a growing number of people on social media. You're like, how could more people possibly get on social media? But it's happening. As technology is becoming more and more available, more and more people are on social media. And it is both amplifying feelings of entitlement. It's amplifying feelings of disconnection. It's amplifying senses of identity that are illegitimate, to your phrasing, to the soul, that doesn't connect to who you are in your deepest self or the most parts of yourself. And simultaneously, social media is one of the most powerful connectors. And there are so many more people finding community who didn't have community before.
True.
And I think this is, again, how we leverage it, because I think there is an essential shift of culture that must occur. And now we're talking about an international culture, because now people from Buenos Aires can talk to people in Japan through a tweet or through an Instagram post or on TikTok or whatever else. And so beyond, I mean, there's like 10,000 paths to take down this one simple idea of how do we address the needs of the youth. So to kind of step away then from that element of technology that's amplifying both the good and the bad, I'd say how important it is just to see what's happening in the home and people supporting each other in the home, because the child who doesn't think they matter, where did they get that message?
Right.
What type of support are they getting or not getting at home? How can we encourage parents to accept and help their children grow, as opposed to meet them with judgment and try to make them different? And there's obviously so much more to be said about that. But
Let me try a little
Okay.
bit
Please.
to add
Yeah.
to this. So let's use some simple terms to talk about what I would call, we can talk about it with many different languages, but small self and big self, okay?
Great.
So small self is that space in us that has a core belief and an inner critic that we're not enough.
Yeah.
And, honestly, in doing work with individuals and groups and organizations for 30 years, with very, very rare exceptions, maybe the Dalai Lama, maybe a few folks who have really gotten to a space where their practice is very, very developed. Most of us have a struggle every day,
Yeah.
including myself for sure, to not drop into that small self space that is saying, really, I don't matter. And really, can't live up to what it is that feels like could be the life that I'm supposed to be living. And that small self space, though, is complicated in that there are all these different sub-personalities. I mean, think about who you are during the course of one day and all the different spaces that come through it. The reason Shakespeare could write Shakespearean plays with all those characters is because he had enough self-awareness
Yes.
to see that all those characters are in us. The Lady Macbeth, the Hamlet, the King Lear, the fool, the jester, the emperor, they're all inside us.
Very Jungian.
Very, very young. And so in the course of a day, if we're in small self and we have many characters competing for our attention, and then you add the isolation effect of
Yes.
all this rising depression among young people and youth, where more and more, there's simple studies that show that teenagers are going out less because they're spending more time in their rooms on the screen.
Yeah.
Or you go into a coffee shop and you look around and you say, what percentage of people here in this coffee shop are actually here visiting with each other, connecting?
Yes.
Say,
Yeah.
and what percentage of us are here on our computers? Okay, now, again, nothing wrong with the computer, nothing wrong with the technological link, but the key is it's not a substitute for the face-to-face connection that lets us feel like, oh, I'm having a connecting moment.
Well, the sheer number of times you've just touched me in this conversation is only capable if we're sitting across from each other.
Exactly. So that's small self. And small self is, right now, we're in a kind of trance. I mean, we wouldn't be heading towards a potential cliff of our own extinction if we weren't in a trance. We would pull up and go, oh my God, I'm awake today. What can I do today to increase compassion in the world and to help reduce carbon pollution? And my small part, what can I do? I'm awake. I love this world. Okay, so big self is that space, and you referred to it as, you can also call it deep self, or you can call it higher self. It's the observing presence. So everybody just try it for a minute. Take a breath and just feel your observing presence that actually is the one who's been looking out from your eyes in every photograph that's ever been taken of you from the time you're 3 years old or a baby all the way to now. It's that centering, observing presence that you is capable of transforming your life.
Right.
Because that you is able to see the repetitive patterns, what the Hindus call samsara, the Buddhists too, that we're caught up in, where we all know this, right? How do I know this? I know this from my own life, where we're caught in these repetitive patterns, and we see that we're caught in repetitive patterns.
Hopefully
we see.
Yeah.
We see that, and we often see that they're addictive.
Yes.
We often see that they're even self-destructive.
We identify with that.
But then we lose the awareness of our capacity and we go right back into them. So in terms
Yeah.
of this consciousness revolution that we're talking about,
Yes.
educating for health and for the survival of our planet, we're talking about 10% of the population. That's what the scientists say it will take as a tipping point. Not just to adopt a different belief system or a different ideology or a political stance, but to actually be awake more and more of the time
Yeah.
in Big Self.
Yeah.
So we're seeing each other and we're seeing the beauty of life and the sentience of life. And we know why we're saving the elephant. Not just that we need to save the elephant, that's great, but we're saving the elephant because we're saving a part of ourself. We're saving a part of our own soul, and we're connected to that space.
Yeah.
So what I would argue is, see, when there's meaning, mental health issues go down. When young people can look out and go, I mean, there are even studies that show, okay, there's a study I saw recently about, okay, the parents who are doing something for the planet, climate change, anti-racism, social justice, the kids in that home feel more hope in the sense that we're defining hope because they see their parents taking some action.
Yeah.
So they literally see a sense of there's meaning. My mom and dad must believe that there's possibility. So
Wow.
when, there's a quote from the Bible, where there is no vision, the people perish. And I would also say where there's no vision, the mental anxiety and pain and sense of isolation goes up. So the macro conversation we were having earlier is directly linked to the micro conversation about mental illness
Well said.
and pain and suffering.
Right.
The moment we actually feel like there really is a great turning, whatever you want to call it, there is a love-based worldwide rising. I honestly believe that you will see people coming out of their pained, self-isolating, mentally tormenting spaces and going, oh my God, I see something to live for. I see my life being meaningful.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I love that you pointed to meaning and vision. And I do feel that somehow we've been skewed, maybe through technology, to have our vision focused more on materialism, consumerism, and basically those two items, materialism and consumerism. And, the mass of men, I'll just speak for the United States, seems to be their focus. And it's not so much on the meaning and vision of a worldwide rising. So how do we, make that happen? How do we engender that to happen? The worldwide wide rising.
Ironic.
Yeah.
I'd say, or maybe not ironic, maybe fitting, what we are literally doing right now in this very moment. Because it's funny, the question I wanted to ask the two of you was, how do we then take this very nebulous, wonderful vision and make it practical for youth as youth become the adults and then they raise their children, et cetera, et cetera. And I was reflecting on the question myself. And at least in part, I think what we're doing right now is the answer. The more people who hear this conversation, hopefully, the more people for whom hope is sparked.
Right.
For whom now when they step into their lives, they act a little bit differently, which then their interaction with someone else allows them a new possibility, allows them to act a little bit differently. And so that's why I do what I do. That's why I have my podcast. That's why I'm a life coach. That's why I help people get their messages out through their own podcasts and YouTube channels and stuff. That's why I do what I do. But I am curious, how do we take what we're doing right now and make that
Bigger?
Yeah, like, in a way that directly impacts youth. I mean, I used to be in the classroom,
Right.
so I got to be this every day with my students.
Right.
And I had the great advantage of being in a Montessori classroom on top of it, so I had even more freedom to work with them on being with themselves
Right.
and having more access to big self, as you said, and have more sense of possibility. And I could do that, and as part of my pedagogy and part of my educational philosophy, and I could be that way. And I just think, how do we start to get that to kids more? Because in my mind, it's through teachers and through parents, but I feel like even that is too limiting because kids are getting so much influence from other places now, which they always did, to be fair and to be clear. Social peers was always how most kids past the age of 12 get their, sense of self from developmentally. But I just feel like there has to be more. There has to be something practical that we can do. So I really wanted to know your guys' thoughts on that.
Yeah.
So a month or so ago, I was in my office, and I was aware that there was one of the climate action protests going on, led by kids, led by middle school students, high school students.
Well, that's cool.
And so I had a break, and I walked down, and I joined the march protest, and
Awesome.
all these beautifully crafted signs that are personal, right? And, I started taking pictures of the signs because the messages were so poignant. And the one that hit me the most was this young woman who turned out to be an activist who had just come to town and gotten a job on environmental issues. And her sign said, she's 22, I think, her sign said, "The sea is rising, and so are we." So, the rising is both an inner and an outer experience. The rising is really it's inspiring each other to have the courage to actually live the life that we know we're supposed to live. I really believe this. I mean, people have a dream, and maybe it was crushed, maybe it was numbed, maybe it was sort of bombarded by too much information in our mad world, in our frenzy. But back there's a dream. There's a sense of a purpose. I really believe this, that people have a sense of their purpose. And if you align your purpose with compassion, if you align your purpose with stewardship of the earth and with a larger vision, however you say it, suddenly your life is informed by a sense of connection to source. And again, there's no need to use religious language here. We can use religious language if we want, but it's a spiritual experience of being connected to something greater than yourself.
Right.
And there are these great little studies. I remember one in particular where they ask, folks in their 50s and 60s, what do they most remember about their college experience? And again, they'll say, well, I remember these 2 classes, but really, I remember this professor. Well, why do you remember this professor? And it's because this professor, this teacher, had exactly what you're talking about, Ryan. This person was lit from the inside with a passion and compassion for life. And see, part of what we're trying to communicate here together, and this, by the way, is live. We've never had this conversation or talked to each other about this before, is we're trying to communicate that there is an aliveness that comes from stepping out and committing yourself to that sense of your higher purpose, dedicated to the benefit of the whole. And I would suggest that every wisdom tradition in the world, not the religious dogma, but the wisdom part of the tradition, has that message to commit yourself to making a difference. And when you do that, the first thing that shows up in your life is all these people show up. You start to meet people who are fellow journeyers and who see you and recognize you, and you start to also then refine yourself to be able to do the thing that you really want to do. You educate and you learn and you grow, and the sense of growing, you see. And the other thing is that I also want to say is, look, we pull this great turning off. It's not the end of the story.
I was about
It's
to
not
say.
like it's not like we're going to create utopia on earth, or that we're going to end all suffering or all evil. We're just going to graduate from our war-weary adolescence to our conscious adulthood, and then the story's just beginning. Then we get to go out into space. Then we get to have vast numbers of other experiences. But we need to change the narrative. I think part of what the key answer to your question is, when you're in a different story, everything looks different. If I'm in the story of I'm not enough, I can't live my real purpose, and the world looks like it's going down, and that there's no hope, well, then I'm going to try to be right about that.
Yeah.
That's what the mind does. If I'm in a story that millions of us are stepping up to be in a more enlightened and aware state, and to reach out to each other and not to take on anybody else's dogmatic belief, no religion, no organization, no particular sort of philosophic or theological dogma. It's really about you and the preciousness of you. And then you see the other and their preciousness. If we start to see and experience that love-based worldwide rising, it's a call to everyone to do their unique thing.
Yeah. I love that. That's so well said. So we'll just wrap up, because that was just such a great ending, but I could go on forever.
I was going to
with
say,
it.
I got lots of ideas to talk about now.
Yeah,
We're just getting started.
Yeah, right. I'm just
We
warming
can
up.
go on. I don't know what the time slot is right now, but what time is it?
3:15.
Oh, perfect. Yeah. So one thing I was reflecting on is that, to me, it feels to me that the cure for fear and lack and scarcity, which creates consumerism, materialism, war, all those things that we're so involved in, is not to focus on those things and curing those things, but to look towards the light and be in the love space, be in the space of actual purpose and contribution and meaning. That seems to be the cure. So I think there needs to be more dialogue about people feeling what their purpose is and going towards that, as opposed to going to fear and lack, which says you better follow the program. You better get a car and a house and get married by 30. That's been the programming for a very long time. To me, what I see, it's very fear and lack based. And people are so scrambling to get those things solved that then they can go into purpose and meaning.
Right.
You see what I'm saying?
Yep.
But I think it really is to speak on more about finding your purpose. Where is the meaning? Where can you contribute? I brought up that story the other day to you, Ryan, about Jay Shetty, who's now, he's a very well-known public speaker. He's an ex-monk, and I think he's a Zen Buddhist monk. And he talked about part of their program when he was in the monastery was to take away all of their resources, including food and shelter, and that there was two separations of the way people dealt with the dilemma. One was to go into scarcity and concern for resources and begging, and the other was to serve. The other population was focused on service and contribution, and that the monks that were focused on service and contribution fared much more favorably. So, I've been thinking about that a lot. Instead of curing, and solving the fear and lack space, the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, maybe speaking more on purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think part of that too, is it okay to add something to that?
Please. Very
Part of
convoluted.
that too, I think, is valuing the experience that you are having as an individual, by which I mean I'm angry, as an example. Okay, I'm angry. Part of what people do is then they think I should not be, there's that should word, I should not be angry. And now you have this whole new conflict in yourself where you're both trying to say, I shouldn't be angry, so you're judging yourself for that, and trying to orient yourself to whatever this love and light is, which you are being disconnected from because you are not accepting your anger. And I think this goes back to the hope orientation. This goes back to this idea that it's okay to be angry. It's okay to be in despair. People think that equanimity means I just never have, quote, negative emotions. And that's not real.
Good luck.
Exactly. It means I have them and I accept them, and in accepting them, they more quickly pass. Or I can use them to my benefit because I have a hope orientation. Then instead of just being, well, I'm angry and that's it, I'm an angry person, now I identify with my feeling. I could say I'm angry right now. Why am I angry? Well, I'm angry because I'm feeling less than, and I'm pushing back. Well, what can I do about it? Because anger is an action-based emotion. It is physical. It is endemic to our bodies to be angry, just as violence is, right? But we can change that. We can transmute that into something else. And I bring that up only because, well, specifically because you said, well, maybe we don't need to specifically address the fear and lack. Maybe it's in this other way. And I think part of that really comes from self-acceptance and not having judgment about our feelings and using those feelings towards something with that hope orientation, using that despair to go, well, there's something I can do about this despair, as opposed to simply saying, well, it sucks.
Yeah.
Or, oh, everyone hates me.
Yeah.
I'm angry because the world hates me, and I hate the world.
Yeah.
Like I feel like there's something to be manipulated there.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about dialogue.
Oh, yes, please.
I like how we're going in a little
Right?
orderly little.
No. Because
Pause button.
you mentioned the word dialogue, and you talked about the insight that what we resist persists.
Yeah.
So if I'm angry and I don't acknowledge that I'm angry, that anger is likely to erupt on somebody else, right? And it persists because I didn't accept that I'm angry. I didn't acknowledge it. Okay, so let's talk about dialogue. So when we founded Project Victory in 1985, we came up with the name Victory, Project Victory, because in the nuclear age, with weapons of mass destruction and now, of course, accelerating climate change, we need a new meaning of the understanding of victory. We need a victory for everyone. We need a victory for the children. We need a victory for the biosphere. We need a victory for humanity. Okay. So the first round of work that we did was dialogue work. And, I literally had the experience, it was a grace-filled experience of going to Los Alamos Labs in New Mexico, having made an appointment with the then director, Dr. Louis Rosen, who had been Oppenheimer's assistant. And, I'm a young whippersnapper. I don't actually know what I'm doing. I'm just acting from faith, from commitment. And I go to have this conversation with him, and I tell him, we're going to do this dialogue on reducing the risk of nuclear war. And we want to have all the different parties involved. And he goes, well, if the nuclear scientists were come, would you make us into the villains? I said, absolutely not. You're in the same dilemma with us, and you know more about the problem and what really is going on than any of us. He said, really? I said, no, really. This is a safe space where people will relate to each other with respect.
Yeah.
So he turned out the whole Los Alamos Labs. We had, conservatives and liberals, peacemakers, military folks. We had 200 citizen representatives. We had senators and congresspeople. And we spent 4 days together talking about reducing nuclear proliferation, nuclear weapons. Okay. Second example, we did a dialogue in upstate New York where we had pretty much every ethnic and religious group represented, gender mixed, on the pain of the planet. And as I told the story to Allison, the first day or so that we did this, everyone went into a space of, my pain is greater than yours. Mm-hmm. My anger and my pain about what was done to my people is greater than yours. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Everyone went into that space, you know. Yeah. I mean, and it was like, okay, all day long this happened where people express their anger. Yeah. And really their anger is kind of the shield for the suffering.
Right.
You know,
100%.
James Baldwin says, you know, hatred is pain turned outward. Yeah. Well, anger is the same kind of thing. Okay. So at the end of the day, we suggested that everybody, there were about 35 people there. Let's get down on the floor and just sit in a circle. And then I suggested, look, can we do this one thing? When somebody shares their pain, their anger, their suffering, whatever it is, there's no crosstalk. This is basic 12-step insight. No crosstalk. I'm not going to try to convince you that your anger is not valid or that the pain of your people, if you're indigenous people and you've seen your civilization and folks wiped out over the last 300 years, or you're coming out of an experience of descendant from slavery or whatever, or women having fought for rights. I'm not going to convince anybody that they're pain. I don't want to convince them. I want to hear them. And the practice is to listen, to receive the other. And that requires being in big self. Yeah. And so I just suggested, look, we're going to listen to each other, no crosstalk back. There's a pause. So by the next morning, we had such a deep evening that one of the members of the dialogue said, you know, let's do something to celebrate the sense of connected that we felt. And he suggested singing a Zulu grieving chant. And then someone else suggested singing Amazing Grace. And the reason is that, you know, the beloved community, as Dr. King says, is not about denying our pain and suffering and injustice and oppression. The beloved community is about, it starts with listening to each other with respect, with regard. And that allows us to then have more self-awareness so that the dialogue is both direction. It's dialogue with the others. We're listening to each other, but it's also a dialogue with the Shakespeare play inside you.
Absolutely.
Where you're listening
100%.
to, oh my God, this voice is up now this is voice up there. And pretty soon you get the hang of being in the witness, of being in the one who's present and there and able to be present for others. Yeah. And of course, you get 10% of the population of this country and the world able to be present for people in that way. That's the basis of the worldwide rising. Because then we're not just venting and recycling our anger. When we express our anger and we get listened to,
received.
We can move beyond it.
Yeah. Wow, I love that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You know, for me, for my purpose, one of, you know, the greatest things that I want to teach is the listening process of holding space, listening without judgment, not guiding, not teaching, not having a dialogue in vocal dialogue, but just receiving someone and then perhaps repeating back to them what I believe I heard them say in bullet points, because that's very affirming, because then a person feels that they're heard and they can correct it and they say, well, it was a little bit more like this. And I think teaching that process to parents, you know, as probably one of the most important parts about conscious parenting, which I'd say a huge percentage of the population does not do, is not able to do, has not had the skills, hasn't practiced that. So for me, I'm very interested in teaching these processes for parents and for young adults as well, because I think that's a really core thing for children's self-worth as well. Self-worth, self-awareness, being heard, being affirmed by not cross-talking. Cross-talking sort of immediately dislocates the person from the affirmation, in an odd way. Yeah, it takes skill to listen without commenting.
Yeah.
It takes skill to listen to another person and to listen to the dialogue within our head, and being aware of the dialogue in our head that's wanting to respond, and quieting that to allow the other person to be heard.
Yeah.
And then affirming that
Exactly.
by repeating back to them. For me, that would be my one point of light purpose that I would like to participate in.
Yeah. It's hard to give what you've never got. And so each time that we listen to someone more fully, and they can learn to listen to others more fully.
Yeah.
Are you both familiar with nonviolent communication? So long, short, for those who aren't, it's a means of dialogue to do exactly what we are describing, which is to help structure how a person describes their discomfort, their wounding, their whatever's happening for them, and gives the person who's listening to them, who theoretically is the perpetrator of, to some degree, those feelings, at least, depending on how much we own our own feelings, right? And then that person has a chance to receive that and respond in kind. And you know something's powerful when it works on 9-year-olds, when it works on 12-year-olds, when it works on 15-year-olds, when it works on 35-year-olds. Watching two 12-year-olds tell each other how mad they are at each other for the thing that they did to them, that they did to each other, right? And saying, okay, hold on, we're going to back up. I want you to make an observation. This is as neutral as you can make it. It has no emotion connected to it. It is as close as possible to the literally telling of what happened. Don't add anything to it. What happened? Well, you shouted at me. Okay. It's a good start. Now, how did that make you feel? Well, when people shout at me, I feel like they're mad at me, and that makes me scared, or that makes me feel hurt, or that makes me whatever. Okay. But what is it that you need? Well, I need to feel included. And when you yelled at me, I felt like you were pushing me out. Okay, so what do you want to happen instead? Well, in the future, I'd really appreciate if you didn't yell at me. If you want something different from me, please ask. Right now, that's a highly evolved version of what the 9-year-old would have done. But when the 9-year-olds wouldn't stop going after each other, and they needed to break it down into that modality, then the other person could say, oh, because there's a problem, there's a solution. There's enough vulnerability for a request, and I can respond to that.
Right.
And I could, and sometimes there are kids who say, I am sorry that I shouted at you.
Yeah.
I need you to know that when you do X, that makes me mad. And that's why I shouted. I would appreciate if you don't do that in the future. And now suddenly we're solutions oriented. We're accepting other people's perspectives. So it's not saying I didn't do that. Because you said you shouted at me because you bought, and now I'm defining for the other person what their experience was. So the whole purpose of nonviolent communication is saying, this is my perspective. This is how I perceived it. I perceived that you were angry because you were yelling.
Interesting.
And now I'm owning myself. I'm owning how that you did a thing that is neutral, and I had an experience of it. And I'm owning and accepting my experience of it, and I'm asking for something from you to honor myself and honor you in the experiencing of that.
Yeah.
And it's amazing what can come out of that. When there's the ownership,
Right.
and the vulnerability, and that dialogue.
Okay.
Right. So, so just to tie these two comments together.
Yeah, because I wanted to cycle back, because I felt like what I was describing was very different from what you described.
So conscious parenting. So I love that phrase, and I just wanted to sort of play with this idea that we're all in our own movie. Everybody at the level of small self is seeing things through our own lens. And that lens is shaped by our experience, our conditioning, often our wounds and the beliefs that we've formed around the wounds. And then we are often caught in a space where we're unconsciously recreating circumstances that are like our old wounds in order to create a transformation, to get healing. So Allison brings up the whole idea of conscious parenting, and Ryan brings up nonviolent communication. So let's see if we can weave them together for a second, because it's like, okay, you have a baby, you have a child, you have children, you have grandchildren, and the easiest thing in the world unconsciously is to project your movie onto them.
Yeah.
You know, I didn't fulfill becoming a high school athlete, so I'm going to work very hard to get my kid to become a college athlete. Or I didn't, what's left on my movie that's incomplete, I'm going to project onto my kid.
Right.
I want him to be this, I want him to do that. The moment that we can stop doing that and actually become interested in who they are as a soul, if you will, as a separate being, and do this mirroring process that Ryan's talking about and that Allison's talking about, where we actually mirror the other with the intention to help our children become who they want to be.
Yeah.
Wow.
Let's let our kids be who they want to be. Let's let them develop that. Let's help them to develop that.
Absolutely.
And have awareness of where we're not allowing that, because we have some pre-designed idea of what's the safest route and the best route for
Fear and
them,
lack,
which is all
again.
fear-based.
Fear and lack.
Right.
Yeah, and that's
Scarcity.
a lack of self-awareness as well. Yeah. So I think that's an important part. But I was just tying into the whole view of each and every one of us doing our individual thing to bring conscious awareness in this rising tide of awareness that we're currently experiencing. You with your worldwide why can't I say that? Rising Project Victory. Ryan with your education and of children and your podcast, Educate for Life. And so I guess we'll just wrap it up. Any closing thoughts or ideas? I welcome them.
I just wanted to acknowledge what you said earlier about active listening and how critical it is that we do our best to reflect back to others as cleanly and clearly as possible what we think they meant. Because it does two things. One, it removes my judgment from them when I'm trying to reflect back to them in the best way possible what they said.
Right.
And it allows them to feel heard. And it's a sense of belonging, for a lack of a better word, being understood. And that each time we're able to do that, and we improve that communication, we actually improve everyone's lives in incremental and powerful ways. Me in my ability to remove my perspective from what you stated to me, and my ability to give that sense of inclusion to you. And I think just to kind of connect everything we've been talking about, I think that's the heart of all of this, is how we are able to big self, small self, how we're able to acknowledge our own feelings, our own judgments, our own anger, how we're able to acknowledge and accept those feelings in others. Yeah. Since I think all judgment is self-judgment. And we really are able, when we move into that space of accepting, then we all rise together.
Right. And I think that really is the essence of compassion and empathy, is to allow others to have their own perceptions and to affirm those, not try to sway them to our liking. Yeah. So
I'm going to try to do the micro and the macro summary. Quick connection here. Okay, so think about the story that we often hear about human history. It's the story of, the Genghis Khans and the Alexander the Greats and the Hannibal and Rome, Carthage, and it's the story of the war for the last 5,000 years of our city-states against each other, of empires, of power, of greed, and who won, who lost, and really there's not much. And then you add to it the story of people who've done amazing things, Jonas Salk and polio vaccine, and these breakthrough creative ideas. But there's a story that's kind of a power-based story.
Yeah.
Now, let me just try this other version of the story, that across time and across different traditions, we have these great souls. Now, these great souls are not different than us. Mahatma Gandhi did not like the term Mahatma because it means great soul, and he always said, look, I am just a person just like you. The only difference is that when I commit to my practice, I keep my practice. It's all it is. That's the only difference. And so the great souls across time have had the experience of being able to touch the timeless, what the Greeks call kairos, the timeless, the vertical, as opposed to just chronos, which is the horizontal dimension of doing. They've had the capacity to go up into the timeless. The most recent version of this that we all know is the Dr. King experience, the last day before he's killed, where he has the mountaintop experience. And they've had this experience of being able to go into the timeless and look down the corridors of time and tell us that we can make the next step of human evolution. And what we've been talking about here, conscious parenting, nonviolent communication, education with a sense of listening and dialogue and presence, non-reactivity. We've been talking about that evolutionary jump that is personal, in that it's about your commitment to being big self, your commitment to get up in the morning and choose hope and make a difference in your life, and then look around and see that, oh my God, we're not alone. There's a whole zeitgeist of us, multi-generational too, rising, across gender, across race, across culture, and that rising is about the next evolutionary step of our humanity that all the wisdom traditions have pointed towards. And this is a different story of humankind. This is the story of creativity, the story of human spirit transcending great obstacles, the story of courage, the story of kindness, the story of decency. And this story is going to win. This story is the story that takes us to the next level. Why is it going to win? Not because we're saints. Not because we're always going to be good. No, Aretha says you got to be bad to be good. It's going to win because right now we have to. We have to. It's an imperative for our survival that, as Abraham Lincoln says, we choose the better angels of our nature because we have to in order to survive and prosper and go on. And that's what everything we've been talking about is about today.
The arc of time is long and toward the good.
Yes, bends towards the good, as Dr. King says.
Yep.
Thank you. Thanks all for
This was
coming.
great.
I really appreciate it. Dr. Craig Schindler, Ryan Francis, Allison Angeles. Thanks for coming and listening. And any comments, please comment below. Subscribe, share, and look up my friends on the tag. Thank you.